Next, Mark Steyn is a conservative columnist, journalist, and author. He's contributed to the National Review, the Jerusalem Post, the Independent, and the Daily Telegraph, just to name a few. His most recent book is titled America Alone, The End of the World as We Know It. The Canadian spends some of his time in Quebec and some in New Hampshire, one of the states, he says, with the least amount of government intrusion. He was recently in Phoenix for the Goldwater Institute's Rose Law Group speaker series, and that's where Larry Lemons caught up with him.
To begin with, why don't we talk about the Canadian perception of American politics? I know Canadians are just as diverse as Americans about how they feel about things. I wonder if you could just talk about how those perceptions might vary between the American government and the American people.
Well, I think if you take out the French Canadians, English Canadians tend to have actually remarkably similar views to Americans on a lot of issues. If you look at the run-up to the Iraq War, for example, the amount of support among English Canadians was not dissimilar to Americans and not dissimilar to Australians and Britons. And the reason why Canada was not in the war with America the way Britain and Australia were is because effectively Quebec, French Canada, was strongly opposed to the war and gets to cast a veto. So in other words, the anti-Americanism of Canada is in many ways driven by the Frenchification of Canada that's gone on since the Trudeau years, basically.
Something of that cliche of the French always hating the Americans.
Well, it's not that. It's that they have a particularly, I think, ridiculous view of the world. You know, the French Canadians were opposed to entering World War I and World War II. Well, you know, in both cases, the British Empire essentially entered those wars to help save France. But French Quebecers would rather leave the liberation of France to the Anglo-Saxons than get in on it themselves. So I think that's basically the issue there, that the Frencher Canada gets, the more anti-American it gets. But, you know, I don't want to depress anyone, but basically English Canadians are among America's best friends on the planet in some ways.
How do you view American politics at the moment, specifically the American presidential race? What are your observations?
Well, you know, the question is, I think, is whether it's one of these cyclical things that, that it's going to be a change. It's going to be a Democratic president, and it's one of those cyclical things that you can't do anything about. And there are elections that are like that. The Republican Party gives the impression that it's exhausted, and I think that's, you know, personally, I regret that, because I think the Democratic candidates are lightweight. I think, in fact, it's farcical when you listen to them talk about national security issues. You know, they're opposed to the war in Iraq, but they don't want to look like a big sissy, weenie, pansy type, the way the Dukakis in a tank scenario. So they suddenly start improvising plans to invade Pakistan and all the rest of it. In other words, instead of addressing the war we're in at the moment, they're opposed to that, but they've got all these I mean, Hillary wants to double the size of the army to fight the next war. I mean, why not try winning this one? So I feel there's a credibility issue among Democratic candidates. But I think it's also clear on the Republican side that really Republican base voters are not yet happy with the choice they've got, and they would welcome a none-of-the-above candidate, and whether Fred Thompson is the none-of-the-above candidate remains to be seen.
As we're doing this interview, the night before, Fred Thompson announced on the Jay Leno show that he's officially running for president. How do you think Fred Thompson's going to fit into the whole thing?
I think he's a broadly sane conservative. He has a conservative temperament, in part because of who he is and how he's lived. Quite how philosophically conservative he is another matter. I mean, his radio addresses that he's been giving the last few months, they sound very good to me. I don't think they're in the Reagan League, but, you know, Reagan, who was dismissed as the ultimate airhead by the wise old owls of the American media in 1980. In fact, Reagan was the one who had thought most about these issues and thought about them in philosophical terms longer than almost any other presidential candidate. I mean, thinking about them for the best part of 30 years by the time he ran. And I don't think Fred Thompson's there yet, but I like the idea of an older, stable, steadying presidential. I do not want a president with good hair. You know, John Edwards has the most beautifully angled nape I've ever stood behind. I remember it from the 2004 campaign, the gloss of it. I almost had to wear sunglasses, but I'm not looking for good hair. I'd like a president who is over 60, who seems like an elderly gentleman at ease with himself. And I think Fred Thompson is tonally appealing. We don't yet know whether the policies match yet.
You know, a lot of people have described Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama specifically as having a kind of star power. And McCain and Giuliani, of course, certainly have a great presence, and Mitt Romney looks very good as well. But Fred Thompson seems to bring that into it. I mean, as you said, maybe you might like to watch him on TV.
Well, I think star power is cruel. I'm slightly skeptical about star power because I think we overvalue it a lot of the time. And let's face it, star power in politics is not quite the same as star power in show business.
Not yet.
No, I mean, show business I think has higher stat. The bar is somewhat lower for star power in politics. But I also find it interesting that when people talk about things like that, for example, John Howard, who has been a 4-time election winner in Australia and has been perhaps America's most important ally in the years since 9/11, is a man whom no one would regard as having star power. He's a stiff, awkward, balding man who is mocked by the Australians for having zero charisma. Yet he has been incredibly impressive. And I think that the lesson of that is that the real star power is with policies and with your position. And if you've got that right, then the star power follows. Similarly, Stephen Harper in Canada is not anybody's idea of a charismatic figure, even by the standards of Canadian prime ministers, which is I mean, so if you're talking about a guy who has low charisma by Canadian prime minister standards, I mean, that is basically in the sub-basement level 5 of charisma. So I think we exaggerate that. What is clear is that there are certain people that, whatever qualities they may bring to the race, you know are not going to be president. As much as you'd like to entertain the idea, I used to love in 2000 going to see a speech by Alan Keyes. He used to start off with a great opening line, "My friends, we stand on the brink of the abyss." And he got cheerier from there, and it was magnificent. But you knew Alan Keyes was never going to be president. And I think we know that Sam Brownback is never going to be president. We know that Ron Paul is not going to be president. We know on the Democrat side, too, that Joe Biden is not going to be president. That there is something that sets in very early on between those who are really in the running and those whom no one has quite plucked up the courage to say, look, this isn't going to happen for you.
And what these other candidates bring to it is the conversation about issues that perhaps the mainstream candidates might not want to go near because of politics. The Ron Pauls, the Mike Gravells, Dennis Kucinich, they will bring up issues the other politicians may not want to address.
Yeah, I think they're quite useful in that sense. I mean, I disagree with Ron Paul, who is too isolationist for me. I don't really think that the idea of America as a 19th century republic aloof from the turmoil of the world is credible these days. You know, the idea of an America that can simply pull up the drawbridge and hold off the world's problems is ludicrous. I mean, it cannot even pull up the drawbridge against two relatively benign neighbors. You don't need to be told that in Arizona. It's not just that you've got half the population of Mexico living here, but I understand from my friends in Toronto and Calgary, about 25% of Canadians are now retiring here. So the idea that America, which can't even hold Canada and Mexico at bay, can kind of hold the rest of the planet at bay, I think is simply incredible. But the fact is, having Ron Paul being anti-Iraq, anti-war on terror in those debates forces McCain and Giuliani and Romney to improve their game when they have to argue why they're in favor of it.
So please, take out your crystal ball. What do you see in the next 5 years?
Well, I think in the next 5 years, my worry is that the combination of factors that we face in the world are the worst kind of things for democratic societies to deal with. You know, we have a huge demographic transformation that is occurring very fast. The United Nations calls it the biggest population transformation in history, in which cities that were homogeneous Scandinavian cities 30 years ago are being turned into majority Muslim cities. Now, the danger there is that if you have a 20% Muslim population, which France will have, maybe not within 5 years, but there's a little beyond that, you are never going to be able to rely on France as an ally again. You think of the difference a few hundred dimpled Chads made in Florida in the year 2000, and then imagine a 20% voting bloc that's Muslim, and think about the reality of France really wanting to send troops into anywhere America's likely to be wanting to send them. The fact of the matter is, this is a permanent divergence between the United States and the European side of the Atlantic Alliance. And I think managing that transition is actually going to be one of the biggest challenges for whoever becomes president.
Mark Steyn, thank you so much for talking with us on Horizon.
My pleasure.